the 1926 hurricane that devastated Miami and exposed the lost golden era of Florida. In September of 1926, the city of Miami was alive with dreams. Every street corner hummed with ambition. Every plot of land carried a promise. And then, in a single night, everything changed. The 1926 hurricane that devastated Miami and exposed the lost golden era of Florida became one of the most defining moments in American history. A moment when nature reminded an entire nation that no fortune is permanent and no paradise is safe from the wind. Chapter 1. The morning of September 17, 1926, began like any other in Miami. The sun rose over Biscayne Bay, casting golden light across the water. Palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze. Along Flagler Street, shopkeepers opened their doors and greeted the day with the same optimism that had drawn thousands to this young city. Miami in 1926 was not just a place. It was a phenomenon, a miracle built on sand and ambition. Just 5 years earlier, the population had barely reached 30,000. By the summer of 1926, it had exploded to over 100,000. People arrived by train, by car, by boat. They came from the cold cities of the north, from the farmlands of the Midwest, from every corner of a nation hungry for something new. They came because they had heard the stories. Stories of fortunes made overnight. Stories of land that doubled in value before the ink dried on the deed. Stories of a tropical paradise where winter never came and opportunity never ended. The land boom of the 1920s had transformed Florida into the promised land of the American dream. Developers carved new neighborhoods out of swamps. Hotels rose along the coastline like temples to prosperity. Coral Gables, Miami Beach, Hialeah, these names became synonymous with wealth and possibility. Advertisements in northern newspapers painted pictures of endless sunshine and limitless potential. Come to Florida, they promised. Come to where your future awaits. And people believed. They believed with the fervor of true believers. They sold their homes, cashed their savings, and headed south. Some became wealthy beyond imagination. Real estate agents, developers, speculators. They rode the wave of enthusiasm to fortunes that seemed almost fictional. A plot of land bought for $500 might sell for $5,000 within weeks. Then $10,000, then $20,000. The numbers defied logic, but logic had no place in the fever dream of the Florida boom. In Miami, construction never stopped. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air from dawn to dusk. New buildings appeared almost daily. The McAllister Hotel, the Olympia Theater, the Venetian Causeway, these structures announced to the world that Miami had arrived. This was no longer a frontier outpost. This was a modern city, a metropolis in the making, a testament to what American ambition could achieve. But beneath the celebration, cracks had already begun to form. The boom had grown too fast, too wild, too disconnected from reality. By the summer of 1926, the first signs of trouble had emerged. Northern banks had grown cautious about Florida investments. The railroad system, overwhelmed by the flood of building materials heading south, had imposed an embargo that slowed construction to a crawl. Some speculators, sensing the shifting winds, had begun to quietly sell their holdings. The smart money was getting out. Yet most people in Miami refused to see the warnings. They had invested too much, believed too deeply, dreamed too vividly to accept that the miracle might end. The newspapers continued to print optimistic headlines. The developers continued to sell their visions. The parties continued late into the humid nights. Miami in September of 1926 was a city balanced on the edge of something it could not yet see. On the morning of September 17th, a woman named Clara Jennings stood on the balcony of her small apartment near downtown Miami. She had arrived from Ohio just 8 months earlier, following her husband Robert, who had taken a job with one of the new development companies. Clara was 27 years old, with dark hair and eyes that still held the wonder of someone discovering a new world. She loved the morning light in Miami, the way it made everything seem golden and possible. Robert had already left for work. Their daughter, 5-year-old Margaret, was still sleeping in the small bedroom they had painted pale yellow. Clara sipped her coffee and watched the palm trees move in the breeze. She noticed the sky looked different that morning. The clouds were thicker than usual, moving faster. The air felt heavy, charged with something she could not name. Across the city, a fisherman named Thomas Wright noticed the same thing. Thomas was 63 years old, born and raised in the Florida Keys. He had seen storms before, many of them. He knew the signs that most newcomers could not read: the way the birds flew lower, The way the fish disappeared from the shallows, the way the sea changed color before a big blow. That morning, standing on the dock where he kept his small boat, Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was going to be bad. He could feel it in his bones. But the official word from Washington said otherwise. The Weather Bureau had been tracking a storm in the Caribbean, but their forecast suggested it would pass to the south of Florida. There was no cause for alarm, they said. Miami could expect some rain, perhaps some wind, but nothing severe. The technology of 1926 was primitive by modern standards. There were no satellites, no radar, no computer models. Forecasters relied on scattered ship reports and educated guesses. They often guessed wrong. By noon, the weather had changed noticeably. The wind picked up. The clouds thickened. A light rain began to fall. Still, life in Miami continued as normal. People went to work, went shopping, went about their daily routines. The newspapers that afternoon made no mention of danger. The city had survived tropical weather before. This would be no different. Clara Jennings picked up Margaret from the neighbor who watched her during the day. They walked home together through streets that were beginning to empty as the rain grew heavier. Margaret splashed in the puddles, delighted by the adventure. Clara held her hand tighter, feeling that strange electricity in the air grow stronger. Robert would be home soon, she told herself. Everything would be fine. Thomas Wright was not so calm. By late afternoon he had secured his boat as best he could and headed to his small house near the waterfront. He had lived through the hurricane of 1906, had seen what the wind could do. He began boarding up his windows, working alone as the rain pelted down. His neighbors thought he was overreacting. He did not care. He knew what was coming even if no one else did. The evening of September 17th brought an eerie quiet. The rain stopped. The wind died down. The clouds seemed to pause in their march across the sky. For a few hours, Miami experienced a deceptive calm. Many residents took this as a sign that the worst had passed. They went to bed believing they had worried over nothing. Clara and Robert Jennings put Margaret to bed and sat together in their small living room. The radio played soft music. Robert talked about a new development project his company was planning, her grand subdivision north of the city that would make them all wealthy. Clara listened and tried to share his enthusiasm, but she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence outside was too complete, too absolute. It felt like the world was holding its breath. At 11 that night, the wind returned, not gradually but suddenly, violently, with a force that shattered windows and tore away the comfortable illusions Miami had built around itself. The Great Miami Hurricane had arrived. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of real people facing impossible moments move you, if you want to understand how single nights can change the course of history, then you belong here. Subscribe now, because what happens next will stay with you long after this story ends. Chapter 2. The wind did not announce itself with subtlety. It arrived like a living thing, howling through the streets of Miami with a fury that defied description. By midnight on September 18th, the storm had wrapped its arms around the city, and it would not let go for hours. Clara Jennings woke to the sound of glass shattering somewhere in the building. Robert was already up, trying to push furniture against the windows. The walls of their apartment seemed to breathe, bowing inward with each gust. Margaret was screaming. Clara grabbed her daughter and held her close, whispering words of comfort she did not believe. The wind outside was nothing like any weather they had experienced in Ohio. This was not a storm. This was an assault. The building groaned and creaked as if it might come apart at the seams. Water began seeping under the door, then streaming, then flooding. Robert shouted something about getting to higher ground, but his words were swallowed by the roar. Across the city, similar scenes were unfolding. In the grand hotels along the beach, guests huddled in hallways and ballrooms as the wind peeled away roofs and sent furniture flying. The wealthy tourists who had come to enjoy paradise found themselves trapped in a nightmare they could never have imagined. Diamond necklaces and silk gowns meant nothing against the indifferent rage of nature. Thomas Wright sat in the corner of his small house, listening to the world tear itself apart around him. His boards held, but just barely. He could hear things hitting the walls, debris carried by winds that would later be estimated at over 150 miles per hour. He thought about his wife, buried 3 years now in the little cemetery near the bay. He wondered if he would see her again before morning. The eye of the hurricane passed over Miami sometime after 3 in the morning. For perhaps 45 minutes, the wind stopped. The rain ceased. An impossible silence descended over the battered city. Many residents, believing the storm had ended, ventured outside to check on their homes and neighbors. This was a fatal mistake. Clara and Robert Jennings stepped out of their building into a scene from another world. The street was unrecognizable. Trees lay everywhere, tangled with power lines and debris. Cars had been overturned, tossed like children's toys. The air smelled of salt and destruction. Other people were emerging from doorways, their faces pale with shock in the strange moonlight that filtered through the parting clouds. Robert wanted to walk down to Flagler Street to check on the office building where he worked. Clara begged him to stay close. Margaret clung to her mother's leg, silent now, her small face blank with exhaustion and fear. They were standing in the street arguing quietly when the wind returned. There was no warning. The backside of the hurricane struck with even greater violence than the front. The winds came from the opposite direction now, catching people who had ventured outside completely unprepared. Robert grabbed Clara and Margaret and ran for the nearest doorway. They made it inside just as the world turned to chaos again. The second half of the storm was worse than the first. The winds had already weakened structures, and now they finished the job. Buildings that had survived the initial assault collapsed. Roofs that had held were ripped away. The storm surge that followed pushed walls of water into neighborhoods that had never flooded before. In the working-class areas near the Miami River, the devastation was absolute. Small wooden houses were reduced to splinters. Families who could not afford the sturdy concrete homes of the wealthy found themselves without shelter, without protection, without hope. The water rose quickly, trapping people on rooftops, in trees, wherever they could find a perch above the flood. A young man named James Porter spent that night clinging to a palm tree with his mother and younger sister. Their house had simply vanished, swept away by the surge within minutes. James was 19 years old, strong and athletic, and he held onto that tree with every ounce of strength he possessed. The wind tried to tear them away. The water rose higher. His mother prayed out loud, her voice barely audible over the roar. His sister, 14, kept her eyes closed and did not speak. For 6 hours they held on. James watched the water carry away pieces of lives, furniture, clothing, photographs, all the accumulated possessions of a community reduced to floating debris. He saw things he would never speak of later, things that would visit him in nightmares for the rest of his life. But he held on. And somehow, impossibly, when the sun rose and the wind finally began to fade, he and his mother and sister were still there, still alive, still holding onto that palm tree in the middle of what used to be a neighborhood. The morning of September 18, 1926, revealed a city transformed. Where there had been streets, there were rivers of mud and wreckage. Where there had been buildings, there were ruins. The storm had not simply damaged Miami, it had unmade it. Clara Jennings and her family emerged from the doorway where they had sheltered to find their apartment building still standing, but barely. The roof was gone. Half the windows were shattered. Everything they owned was soaked and scattered, but they were alive. Margaret looked at the destruction with wide eyes, too young to understand, too young to know how close they had come to disappearing. Thomas Wright opened his door to find a boat sitting in his front yard. It was not his boat. He had no idea where it had come from. His own boat, the one he had spent years paying off, was nowhere to be seen. He would learn later that it had been carried more than 2 miles inland, deposited in a field as if placed there deliberately. The death toll would take weeks to calculate, and even then, the true number would never be known. Officially, the hurricane killed somewhere between 300 and 400 people in Miami and the surrounding areas, but many historians believe the actual number was much higher, perhaps 800 or more. In 1926, record-keeping was imperfect, and many of the victims were seasonal workers, migrants, the invisible people whose lives were not always counted. What could be counted was the destruction. More than 4,000 homes were destroyed completely. Another 9,000 were damaged beyond easy repair. Every major hotel along the beach had been devastated. The railroad lines were underwater. The roads were impassable. The power grid was gone. Miami, the miracle city, the symbol of American ambition, lay in ruins beneath the September sun. And somewhere in that wreckage, mixed with the shattered glass and twisted metal, lay the dreams of a generation. The Florida land boom, already weakening before the storm, would not survive this blow. The hurricane had not just destroyed buildings, it had destroyed a myth. Chapter 3. To understand what the hurricane truly took from Florida, one must first understand what Florida had become in the years before the storm. The land boom of the early 1920s was not simply an economic phenomenon. It was a collective fever dream, a mass delusion built on optimism, greed, and the peculiar American belief that tomorrow would always be better than today. The story began, as so many American stories do, with the railroad. Henry Flagler, the oil magnate who had partnered with John D. Rockefeller to build Standard Oil, turned his attention to Florida in the 1880s. He saw what others missed, a warm paradise waiting to be developed, connected, civilized. Flagler built his railroad down the east coast of Florida, and wherever the tracks went, development followed. By the time Flagler died in 1913, Florida had transformed from a frontier territory into an emerging destination for wealthy Americans seeking escape from northern winters. But it was the automobile that truly unlocked Florida's potential. When roads improved enough to allow driving from New York or Chicago to Miami, the gates opened wide. The 1920s brought unprecedented prosperity to America. The war was over. The economy was booming. A new generation had money to spend and dreams to chase. And Florida, with its sunshine and beaches and promise of eternal summer, called to them like a siren. The psychology of the boom was fascinating and troubling. People who had never speculated in their lives suddenly became real estate investors. Factory workers bought lots in subdivisions they had never seen. Teachers purchased options on properties that existed only on maps. The logic was simple and irresistible. Prices were rising. They had always risen. They would always rise. The only risk was in not participating. Developers played to these desires with skill and showmanship. George Merrick created Coral Gables as a Mediterranean fantasy, complete with plazas, fountains, and streets lined with coral rock. Carl Fisher transformed a mangrove swamp into Miami Beach, dredging sand from Biscayne Bay to create beaches where none had existed. These men were artists of a sort, painting visions of paradise that people desperately wanted to believe in. The advertising was relentless and effective. Newspapers across the country carried stories of ordinary people who had become millionaires through Florida land deals. Some of these stories were true, many were exaggerated, a few were complete fabrications, but they all served the same purpose. They fed the fever. By 1925, an estimated $2.5 billion had poured into Florida real estate. In Miami alone, there were more than 2,000 licensed real estate offices. Lots changed hands 3 and 4 times in a single day, each transaction pushing the price higher. The phrase "binder boy" entered the vocabulary, describing the young men who would purchase a binder on a property in the morning and sell it for profit by afternoon. But the foundations of this prosperity were dangerously thin. Much of the development was financed with borrowed money and speculative credit. The actual population growth could not keep pace with the construction. Hotels were built for tourists who might never come. Subdivisions were platted in swamps that would never drain. The gap between promise and reality grew wider with each passing month. The warning signs appeared in early 1926. The railroad embargo slowed the flow of building materials. Banks in northern cities began refusing Florida mortgages. The stream of newcomers slowed to a trickle. Some developers, sensing the shift, began quietly liquidating their holdings. But for most participants in the boom, denial was easier than acceptance. The hurricane, when it came, did not create the collapse. The collapse was already inevitable. What the hurricane did was accelerate it, strip away the illusions, expose the fragile truth beneath the golden promises. In a single night, nature accomplished what years of speculation had made certain. The economic devastation was immediate and total. Insurance companies, overwhelmed by claims, would pay only a fraction of what they owed. Many simply declared bankruptcy. Property values, which had been inflated beyond all reason, collapsed overnight. The lot that had sold for $50,000 last spring was now worth perhaps $2,000. And even at that price, there were no buyers. The human cost went beyond the death toll. Thousands of families had invested everything in the Florida dream. Teachers who had emptied their retirement accounts, farmers who had sold their land, factory workers who had borrowed against their futures. These people did not die in the storm, but something in them died afterward. Their faith in the promise of America, in the idea that hard work and optimism would be rewarded, that faith lay in the wreckage alongside the shattered buildings. In the weeks following the hurricane, a great exodus began. The same trains and automobiles that had brought hopeful dreamers south now carried them north again. They left behind unpaid mortgages, abandoned construction projects, and the remnants of lives built on sand. Miami, which had swelled to over 100,000 people during the boom, would shrink dramatically in the years that followed. The local government tried desperately to minimize the damage to Florida's reputation. Chamber of Commerce officials pleaded with newspapers not to exaggerate the destruction. They feared, correctly, that negative publicity would deliver the final blow to an already wounded economy. But the truth could not be hidden. Photographs of the devastation appeared in newspapers across the country. The myth of Florida as paradise lay exposed. If you have ever watched something you believed in fall apart, if you have ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet, then you understand what the people of Miami experienced. Leave a comment saying, "I have felt this," because this story is not just about a hurricane or a real estate boom. It is about the fragile nature of all our dreams and how quickly the world can remind us of what truly matters. Chapter 4. The storm had passed, but the work of survival was only beginning. In the days immediately following the hurricane, Miami existed in a state of suspension between the world that had been and whatever world would come next. There was no power. There was limited water. The streets were impassable, and everywhere there was need. Clara Jennings learned something about herself in those first days. She learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. With Robert injured, a deep gash on his arm that would later require stitches, Clara became the one who ventured out to find water, to find food, to find news of what was happening. She left Margaret with their neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose apartment had somehow survived mostly intact, and she walked through the ruins of her adopted city. What she found was destruction beyond description, but also something else. Everywhere she went, she saw people helping people, strangers sharing their last bottles of water, neighbors digging through rubble to rescue someone they had never met. A man with a boat, his own boat that had miraculously survived, ferrying people across flooded streets without asking for payment or thanks. The disaster had stripped away the pretensions and the divisions. What remained was simple humanity. The African-American community of Colored Town, later known as Overtown, had been devastated by the storm. These neighborhoods, already neglected by city planners and builders, had offered little protection against the hurricane's fury. The wooden houses had splintered like matchsticks. The death toll in these areas was particularly high, though it would never be accurately recorded. Yet from this devastation emerged stories of remarkable courage. A woman named Bessie Coleman, no relation to the famous aviator, organized her neighbors into a system of mutual aid that became a model for the entire recovery effort. She had nothing herself. Her house was gone, her possessions were scattered. But she had will, and that proved to be enough. Within days, she had established a network that ensured no one in her community went hungry, that the sick received care, that the children were watched over. James Porter, the young man who had survived the night clinging to a palm tree, found his purpose in the aftermath. He joined a group of volunteers who spent their days searching through rubble for survivors, then for the dead. It was grim work, heartbreaking work, but James understood its necessity. These were his neighbors. This was his city. He would not let them be forgotten. The official response to the disaster was slow but eventually substantial. The American Red Cross mobilized its largest relief effort to date, sending hundreds of workers and millions of dollars in aid. The National Guard arrived to maintain order and assist with rescue operations. President Calvin Coolidge, though he never visited Florida personally, directed federal resources to the stricken region. But the real recovery happened in smaller moments, in countless acts of kindness and determination that no official record would ever capture. A baker whose shop had been destroyed set up a makeshift oven in the street and began producing bread for anyone who needed it. A doctor worked for 3 days straight without sleep, treating wounds and setting bones and delivering babies in conditions that would have been unimaginable a week earlier. A group of teenagers organized a bucket brigade to clear water from flooded homes, working until their hands were blistered and their backs ached. Thomas Wright, the old fisherman who had seen the storm coming, emerged as an unlikely leader in his neighborhood. His experience and his calm in the face of disaster made him someone others turned to. He organized work parties to clear debris. He mediated disputes over scarce resources. He sat with the grieving and listened to their stories. He had lost almost everything in the storm, but he had gained something too, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his wife died. The physical rebuilding began almost immediately. Miami had been built once on ambition and dreams. Now it would be rebuilt on stubbornness and necessity. Construction crews worked through the fall and winter, clearing rubble, repairing what could be repaired, demolishing what could not. The landscape of the city changed. Some landmarks would never be restored. Others would rise again, different than before. Clara Jennings and her family faced a choice that thousands of others faced as well: stay or go. Robert's company had collapsed along with the land boom. There was no job waiting for him, no future that they could see. The dream that had brought them to Florida seemed foolish now, naive, the fantasy of people who had not understood the risks they were taking. They stayed. Clara could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the connections they had made during the crisis, the bonds forged in shared suffering that felt stronger than anything they had known before. Perhaps it was simply that going back to Ohio would have meant admitting defeat, and Clara Jennings was not ready to admit defeat. Robert found work with a construction company, helping to rebuild the city he had once dreamed of developing. The pay was modest, the work was hard, but there was dignity in it, a satisfaction in seeing something rise from the ruins. Margaret grew up playing in half-finished buildings, watching her father and his colleagues put Miami back together one nail at a time. The recovery was not complete, and would not be for years, but something had changed in the people who survived. They had seen the worst. They had lost much, and yet they were still here, still working, still hoping. The naive optimism of the boom years was gone, replaced by something more durable. Not optimism exactly, but determination, a refusal to surrender to circumstances. This was the true legacy of those dark days. Not the destruction, though that was real and terrible. Not the end of the land boom, though that changed Florida forever. The true legacy was the discovery of what people could be when everything was taken away. When the trappings of prosperity vanished, when the illusions shattered, what remained was community, compassion, and the stubborn human will to survive. Chapter 5. The years following the hurricane brought further trials to Florida. As if the storm had been merely the first act of a longer tragedy, the economic collapse deepened and spread. The land boom was over, and nothing would bring it back. By 1927, banks across Florida were failing. The institutions that had financed the speculative frenzy could not survive its collapse. More than 150 banks closed their doors in Florida between 1926 and 1929, wiping out the savings of countless families who had already lost so much. The economic devastation that would engulf the entire nation in 1929 arrived in Florida 3 years early. The Mediterranean fruit fly infestation of 1929 dealt another blow to a state already reeling. The agricultural sector, which might have provided some economic stability, was devastated by the quarantine measures necessary to control the pest. Crops were destroyed. Farms were abandoned. The suffering continued. And then, of course, came the Great Depression. Florida, which had experienced its own depression since 1926, now joined the rest of America in economic catastrophe. The tourism industry, which had sustained some hope of recovery, collapsed as Americans could no longer afford vacations. Hotels that had been rebuilt after the hurricane stood empty. The beautiful developments that had been the pride of the boom years fell into disrepair. And yet Florida did not die. The same qualities that had drawn people to this place before the hurricane continued to attract them. The sunshine did not fade. The beaches did not disappear. The warm winters remained when the north grew cold. Slowly, gradually, people began to return. The New Deal brought federal investment to Florida. The Civilian Conservation Corps built parks and facilities that would serve the state for decades. New roads were constructed, infrastructure improved. The foundation was laid for a different kind of prosperity, one built on more sustainable principles than the speculation of the 1920s. World War II transformed Florida in ways that the hurricane never could. Military bases proliferated across the state. Servicemen from across the country trained in Florida's favorable climate, and many of them fell in love with the place. When the war ended, they returned with their families, beginning a new migration that would eventually dwarf the boom of the 1920s. Miami specifically rose again. The city that had been devastated in 1926 became by mid-century one of the most important cities in America. The port expanded. The tourism industry evolved. Cuban exiles transformed the culture and economy. The city that Carl Fisher and George Merrick had dreamed of building finally existed, though in forms they could never have imagined. Thomas Wright lived to see some of this transformation. He died in 1948 at the age of 85, still living in the same small house near the waterfront that had somehow survived the hurricane. His neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. High-rise buildings now blocked his view of the bay. The quiet fishing community he had known as a young man had become part of a modern metropolis. But he had made his peace with change. He had learned, on that terrible night in 1926, that nothing was permanent, that holding too tightly to any dream was foolish. Better to adapt, better to accept, better to find joy in what remained rather than mourning what was lost. Clara and Robert Jennings stayed in Miami until their deaths, both in the 1970s. They watched their daughter Margaret grow up, marry, have children of her own. They saw the city transform from the ruins of their early years together to a thriving international metropolis. Robert never became the wealthy developer he had imagined when they first arrived, but he built a good life, a solid life, a life grounded in the reality of work and family rather than the fantasies of speculation. Margaret, in her later years, often told her grandchildren about the hurricane. She had only fragmentary memories of the event itself. She was too young, but she remembered the aftermath. She remembered the feeling of community, of neighbors helping neighbors. She remembered her mother's strength and her father's determination. These memories shaped her understanding of what mattered in life, what could be counted on, what could be trusted. James Porter became a schoolteacher. He spent 40 years in the Miami public schools, teaching history to generations of students. He never talked much about his own experience in the hurricane, but it informed everything he taught. He wanted his students to understand that history was not just dates and names. It was people. People who faced impossible situations and somehow found ways to survive. People who lost everything and rebuilt. People whose courage and compassion deserved to be remembered. The 1926 hurricane changed Florida forever. It ended an era of speculation and fantasy. It exposed the fragility beneath the golden promises. It revealed that nature was not a passive backdrop for human ambition, but an active force that could reshape everything in a single night. These lessons would be forgotten and relearned many times in the decades to come. Florida would see other hurricanes, other booms, other collapses. The cycle would repeat. Cycle. But for those who lived through September 1926, the lessons were permanent. They had looked into the eye of the storm and seen something true about the world and about themselves. They had discovered in the midst of devastation what human beings were capable of when everything else was stripped away. That knowledge was their inheritance, passed down through generations, a gift born from tragedy. Chapter 6. And so the story ends where it began, with the wind. On a September morning in 1926, the wind came to Miami and changed everything. It came without warning, without mercy, without discrimination between rich and poor, old and new, worthy and unworthy. It came and it took and it left behind a city in ruins, and a generation forever marked by its passage. But stories do not really end. They transform. They echo through the years, carried forward by those who remember and those who were told. The hurricane of 1926 is part of Florida now, part of the collective memory of a place that has known so much transformation, so much building and destruction, and building again. The city that exists today, where Miami once stood in ruins, bears little physical resemblance to what came before. The skyline glitters with towers that would have seemed impossible to the people of 1926. The population has grown beyond anything the boosters of the 1920s could have imagined. Technology has advanced in ways that make the primitive forecasts of that era seem almost quaint. And yet, every hurricane season, the people of South Florida watch the weather reports with particular attention. They know something that perhaps only those who live in places touched by such power can truly know. They know that beneath the comfortable surface of modern life, beneath the air conditioning and the satellite imagery and the building codes, the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Nature is stronger than we are. The wind can still come. This is not a cause for despair. It is, if understood correctly, a source of wisdom. The hurricane of 1926 taught Florida that dreams built on sand can wash away. But it also taught that people can rebuild, that communities can come together, that loss can lead to growth, that endings can become beginnings. Clara Jennings understood this. Thomas Wright understood this. James Porter understood this. They learned it in the hard way, the only way such lessons can truly be learned. They carried that knowledge with them through the rest of their lives, and they passed it on to those who came after. The real golden era of Florida was not the speculative frenzy of the early 1920s. That was fool's gold, bright and attractive but ultimately worthless. The real golden era was what came after, the decades of steady growth, of building on solid foundations, of communities bound together by shared experience and mutual aid. Today, if you walk the streets of Miami, you will find no monuments to the 1926 hurricane. No grand memorials mark the places where so many suffered and died. The city has moved on, as cities do, covering the scars with new construction and new dreams. But the hurricane is still there, in a sense. It is there in the building codes that require structures to withstand powerful winds. It is there in the emergency management systems that track storms and coordinate evacuations. It is there in the cultural memory of a state that knows it lives in partnership with forces beyond its control. And it is there, perhaps most importantly, in the stories. Stories passed down through families, stories told in classrooms and living rooms. Stories that remind us of what was lost and what was found, of the fragility of our ambitions and the resilience of our spirits. The 1926 hurricane that devastated Miami and exposed the lost golden era of Florida was, in the end, more than a natural disaster. It was a revelation. It revealed the hollow foundations of a boom built on speculation. It revealed the strength that emerged when those foundations collapsed. It revealed something essential about what human beings are capable of when faced with the worst. This is what history teaches us when we are willing to listen. Not just the dates and the statistics and the economic analyses, but the human truths that underlie them. The fact that life is uncertain, that security is an illusion, that what we build can be destroyed, and also this, that we can endure, that we can help each other, that the wind may take our houses, but it cannot take our humanity, that in the ruins of our greatest failures, we often find the seeds of our greatest strengths. The people of Miami learned this in September 1926. Their lesson belongs to all of us now. It is our inheritance, a gift from a generation that saw the worst and somehow found a way forward. May we be worthy of their courage. May we remember their suffering. May we carry their wisdom into whatever storms our own futures hold. The wind still blows in Miami. The palm trees still sway. The sun still rises over Biscayne Bay, casting golden light across the water. And somewhere in the morning breeze, there is an echo of September 1926, a reminder of what was, a promise of what can be. Remember, if you watched until this moment, you were not simply watching a video. You were walking through history, feeling the weight of storms that shaped a nation. If you made it this far, it is because you carry something special within you, a respect for the past, a curiosity about the human experience, a heart that understands why these stories matter. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your presence here means everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the storms in your own life and the resilience that got you through, then please hit the like button. That simple action helps more people discover these stories, helps keep this channel alive and growing. And if you know someone who would appreciate this journey through history, share this video with them. Stories are meant to be shared. Memories are meant to be passed on. Finally, if you are not yet subscribed, this is your invitation. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story, because there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of courage and loss, of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, of the moments that define us and the lessons that guide us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering with me. Until the next story.